Well, hello and good afternoon. Okay, try that again. Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'm William Bird. I'm the Director of Media Monitoring Africa, and it gives me a very great delight and pleasure to introduce the session this afternoon. I'm going to be very brief just because of the fact that we've got two amazing people to run us through the session. The reason MMA is hosting this is because we played a small role in helping our guest speaker, Marcel, with some of the data. And it's an area in which Media Monitoring Africa has been doing some work over the last couple of years. And Marcel is a great friend to Media Monitoring Africa. He lends his expertise to a Reporting on Children course where he helps spread the gospel around understanding trafficking in persons. So today we really are very thrilled and lucky to have a man who has a very particular set of skills. He finds them and he uses them to produce an incredibly rich report that has got findings that are both shocking and amazing to hear about. And to help unpack that, we've got another amazing South African in the shape and form of Uveka Rangappa, who's going to be leading the discussion with them. So again, a huge thanks to Marcel for being with us and to Uveka for offering to facilitate this session and look at this report, the title of which you can see there. And obviously a huge thanks to USAID, as well as Laser Pulse, Purdue University, South African Human and Community Development Center at University of Wits, Colisa Management Services, and supported by Department of Science and Innovation. There are a lot of partners in this, as you can see across the base of that thing, and they've all contributed various bits and pieces of information to help us understand something that, broadly speaking, occurs in the shadows. So that's it. That's all you're going to hear from me. I'm going to hand you over to the very capable and fabulous hands of Uveka Rangappa and Marcel van der Walt. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Uveka is in the midst of load shedding and is obviously having a small technical glitch, and she will be with us in just one moment. I'm just waiting for a nod from our fabulous colleague to see if she's there and if she's able to speak. Uveka, can you hear us? You know, it's only been 2 years or 3 years now and a bit, or however long this terrible pandemic has been with us. And yet still some of the basics around communication, we still can't get right around using a platform like Zoom. It doesn't help that coming to you live from South Africa, we've just had our stage load shedding increased. And that, for those of our international guests, means that basically there are timed power cuts in order to stop the entire system from collapsing. We have something called load shedding. It is the bane of our lives in this wonderful, beautiful country, which is filled with lots of evil people trafficking in people. But maybe until we get to Uveka there, and because we're on a very tight time schedule, I want to ask Marcel if he can just introduce himself and kick us off a little bit about the report. You talk about the title of it and give us a little bit of an intro so that when Uveka is with us, we're able, she is there now, I believe, she can take over from me because this is not my talent. Thanks. Over.
Great, thank you, William, and hello to all the visitors and the attendees. Thank you so much, William Mshadu and the Media Monitoring Africa, just for your work over the years. I know, William, the first time we met is 2008 at the SAPSAC conference. So appreciate your work in this. Media Monitoring Africa has also done a phenomenal a contribution to what I'll be speaking about briefly this morning. But to start off with, this is the first report in a much larger comprehensive study. This is a technical report that focuses specifically on prevalence insight from South Africa's criminal justice system and relevant reporting mechanisms. So from the media, civil society, through the court system, up until a point where we get a successful prosecution. And so the full report will be unembargoed, or the embargo will be lifted in March. And the purpose of this report really was to document available sources of evidence that simply, to a very large extent, over the last 20 years have been omitted. And there's been a lot of claims made about human trafficking. I'll go into that in the next moment. That is fundamentally dislodged from actual evidence, court records, police statistics, and practitioners' experience. And that's been very worrying, very unsettling, because that research studies filters and it spills over into conversations in the media, and it really presented in many ways a contorted, dislodged view of human trafficking in South Africa. So that was the primary reason of this study, is juxtaposing it against very prominent, or kind of juxtaposing it with very prominent studies that claims human trafficking is not a problem, and looking at what those studies consulted, the evidence that was consulted, the prevalence related statements that they make, and then looking at, well, what evidence was not consulted and omitted in these studies, and that's what this report is at the essence of this report. And it does paint a unsettling picture in terms of the vast amount of research and data that's simply never been captured. So I firmly believe that this report and the larger study is really going to shift the boundaries of our knowledge in South Africa around the issue of human trafficking. And I hope and believe that, and William, for you and the journalists out there, that we will no longer have conversations around, well, is human trafficking a problem, and questioning whether this issue is a problem, because it is a problem. It's very, very systemic in South Africa. And yeah, and I hope through this report and the larger comprehensive report that all of that will be unpacked. William, any updates from you, or shall I just go into the presentation and then we'll take it from there? Oh, Uveka is here. Hello.
Sorry, Marcel, I can see that she's unmuted. However, she's not audible, so it might be an audio issue, so you can proceed in the meantime.
Okay, let me proceed. So the first question that really I think that quizzed me as far back as, I think, the early 2000s, mid 2000s, especially the late 2000s, was this notion questioning whether human trafficking is a problem. We know South Africa ratified international obligations in 2004, and then in the late 2000s, studies came out in the lead up to the World Cup, and these studies found that, well, it was predominantly in South Africa's sex trade, around the issues of sex trafficking, and these studies found in the research that sex trafficking is not a problem, right? And I remember I was in 2009, I was a member of the Hawks, and one of these research studies was presented, and I vividly remember all of us sitting around the table and we were wondering, but this is not congruent with our own experiences. You know, we investigate these cases, we travel throughout the country, and we see these things happen. And the research found, well, sex trafficking is not a problem in Cape Town. And so just some of the claims that was made in previous research, and the reason I'm just highlighting a few vignettes is these are prominent studies that became the go-to research in terms of prevalence of human trafficking in South Africa. Okay, amongst others, very little trafficking into the sex trade or the sex work industry in Cape Town. Few sex buyers, I can't see my screen here, employ the services of very young sex workers, and no evidence of children in brothels. No indication of a major influx of sex workers, over the World Cup period. And then in 2014, the first two studies, a 2008 study and a study in 2010, was consolidated. And these two studies was then presented as the South African situation around prostitution and sex trafficking. And the 2014 study basically stated little evidence, or there's little evidence to suggest. And then there's a lot of things that the researchers list and state that there's little evidence of that. And, those were typically issues that prosecutors and investigators work with on a daily basis. At the time that these research studies came out, especially up until 2010, as I mentioned, that, practitioners was in the field, yet the research was dislodged or different or did not reflect what was actually happening in practice. And later on, studies revealed that, definitions wasn't used correctly, or that brothel owners and people in prostitution were part of the research studies, but practitioners was omitted. Evidence in the criminal justice system wasn't there. So clearly there was pockets of evidence that could have been consulted and omitted, and one could argue skewed evidence around prevalence in South Africa, and then overlaid with definitions not being used correctly. And that's mentioned in the report. More recently, in 2020, a study by the Center for Child Law suggested, again, that human trafficking is not well understood. It's rarely encountered in South Africa. It referred to the myths of child trafficking, and there's little evidence of sex trafficking in the country. So there's a big focus here on sex trafficking, the sex trade, and trafficking is not a problem. So that's quite a theme that we see in research. And then unfortunately, these themes and these assertions, it spills over into other conversations, public conversations, dialogues. One example is in September 2020, literally a month after the latter report was released, the police spokesperson, Vish Naidu, claimed that without fear or contradiction, that human trafficking is not a problem in South Africa, and that there were no active investigations at the time of the interview in September 2020. And he further concluded that South Africa was doing far better than Western countries and other African countries in response to TIP. So clearly, again, practitioners listened to this, and people were wondering, but what the heck is going on? And I vividly remember the interviewer, the anchor of the news program, questioning this, and this was the position: human trafficking is not a problem in South Africa. So in a long and the short is that there were studies, historical studies, that consistently claim this is not a problem in South Africa, predominantly in studies around the sex trade. And then again, spilling over to conversations and assertions by politicians, people in the media, and influential people claiming this is not an issue, okay? So that is a problem, because that has got policy implications and a very real harm to communities affected by this, victims of trafficking that inevitably are undercounted and overlooked, and that really falls through the crevices. So for the purpose of this study, again, as mentioned, we looked at these sources of information. What does the media say? What does civil society say? Police statistics and prosecution data. I'm going to run through this very quickly. And what is very clear is that, and I've just taken a 30-year period, evidence of human trafficking in South Africa, embedded systemic evidence, dates back, media articles, obviously before 1990, but as far back as 1990. There was consistent reports of human trafficking, labor-related issues, sex trafficking, child sex trafficking, children in brothels, etc. Literature, we saw here in 1996 that there was a lot of literature. Now, remember, in 1996, there was still no international legal framework for human trafficking, also not in South Africa. But clearly there were studies. In 1996, there was a study in Cape Town. It was like a 2-week study or 3-week study where they went into Cape Town and they visited brothels. And they documented little girls as young as 10 in brothels, children in brothels. They spoke to sex buyers, and consumer level demand for both children, adult sexual services was very well documented. So the trafficking thread was very clear in studies, research studies dating back to the mid-1990s. Now one needs to start asking, but why aren't these sources consulted? Why are these sources not included in historical studies, right? Here is where Media Monitoring Africa came in with a Dexter system, Media Monitoring Africa and Open Cities Lab. And what they documented, and we asked them to please, and it was a very, very strict criteria that we looked for, was human trafficking reports in South Africa. And there was a lot of all the fluff was kind of removed, and we look at what can we clearly say there's sufficient evidence that this is the prevalence of reporting in the media. So since 2013, between 2013 and 2022, at least 2,268 reports in the media related to human trafficking. Now, we obviously weren't able to ascertain, was it sex trafficking, labor trafficking, what types of trafficking it was, but typically human trafficking related reporting in the media, 2,268 cases. I know that the NFN, the National Freedom Network, has a much broader range of search indicators with Google, and they reported about 3,500 media reports. However, the Dexter system is very, very rigorous, and this is pretty much what the picture is in terms of media reports between 2013 and 2022. Then the data also includes civil society data, lived experiences, numbers, qualitative data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 0800 222 777. I'm not sure if any of them are here, but they're doing a phenomenal work. And part of this research is one of the findings and recommendations is, one of the strong findings and recommendations is that the National Human Trafficking Hotline must become one of the official reporting mechanisms. Now, I cannot overstate the following. The high-level technology that was made available by Media Monitoring Africa and Open Cities Labs, likewise, the significant technology that civil society organizations like the National Human Trafficking Hotline and Love Justice has access to, that really is able to quantify the problem and really in a granular level of detail, provide insights in terms of human trafficking, prevalence, trends, modus operandi, etc. And not even all of that is documented in this report. I mentioned to William before we started this meeting is that the actual data, the lived experiences and the core data that went into this report is really a fraction of what is really out there. And then we're not even talking about those cases that's not being documented. Love Justice International, also a phenomenal organization, are actually doing airport and border monitoring where they identify possible victims of trafficking before they enter the country. So again, all of these things are documented in the report, and you can really have a good idea in terms of how they operate, the work that they do. The National Freedom Network, I worked as a case manager for the National Freedom Network for about 10 years. And in that period, we documented about 850 cases related to trafficking. Now, the first challenge we have with these organizations, personal experience as well, is that so many of the reports are reported to human trafficking task teams, are reported to law enforcement officials. So many of them, they don't even get a case number, an inquiry number. Very often we have cases not even being followed up. I know there's somebody on this call that does terror-related, the terrorism nexus with human trafficking. We've had at least 3 cases that I personally dealt with where the informants would provide the information, tangible information, names, telephone numbers, routes, a clear nexus with Al-Shabaab, corruption into South Africa, trafficking individuals from Somalia into South Africa at $6,000 to $8,000 per person. Significant amount of money that is very likely generated by a terrorism nexus with human trafficking in South Africa. That's been reported to South African authorities. To this day, no response to that email. So unfortunately, that's one of so many examples of a non-response to many of these cases. We also looked into missing children in South Africa and their data. And clearly with the court cases, we do see a nexus with a fair number of human trafficking cases and missing children. Again, SAPS statistics. Now, again, all of this at the backdrop of human trafficking is rarely encountered. It's not a problem on record, and there's an asterisk there. SAPS on their CAS system has more than 11,000 human trafficking cases reported. Now, the reason for the asterisk there is the following. That it's arguably undercounted according to SAPS. They say that it requires action from the police. Many of these cases are rarely reported, etc. And each one of those cases arguably has one victim or more, or one perpetrator or more. So the Hawks cases, they've got 91 cases reported to the Hawks. And in those 91 cases, there were 630 victims recorded. It's not known how many victims are in the 11,000 cases, at least one per case, arguably far more than one per case in many of the cases. Now, the question is, if you are recording 630 victims in 91 cases, speculatively, what could the number of victims be in those 11,000 plus cases? Then you start seeing how these numbers rise. Minister Becky clearly in between 2018 and 2021 reported 781 South African child victims of trafficking. And we know even those numbers are highly likely to be an undercount. Missing persons data, all in all, between 2000 and 2020, 31,544 people that still unaccounted for missing. Between 2000 and 2015, the numbers were 23,800 adults and 3,900 children still missing. Now, clearly, it doesn't mean that, not all missing people are trafficked. Clearly not. There's a range of reasons why people go missing, but we could argue that many of those who are trafficked are most probably missing. Okay, this is the ongoing cases. I'm not going to go into too much detail. These were the ongoing cases in 2021. Sex trafficking, the overwhelming majority of those cases that were ongoing in our courts, forced marriage cases, labor cases, and other cases. Then we look at the victims, the breakdown of victims, genders, nationalities, traffickers. And it was interesting here with the traffickers, in the successfully prosecuted. Let's just quickly go to the nationalities here. Top tier nationalities in ongoing cases for 2021 was South Africans at 73, Nigerian nationals for 44. All 44 of those Nigerian nationality cases, criminal cases, were sex trafficking cases in the sex trade. Again, majority there. Okay, so at the time of the research, 44 cases were successfully prosecuted. At this point in time, we stand at 50 cases successfully prosecuted, and our dear friend, Professor Beate Kruger, is on the call. She's done phenomenal work over the years in research and helping to consolidate these cases, and she's just been a star in that. But for the purpose of the study, up until the closing of the study, 44 cases were recorded. Again, sex trafficking, the majority of those. And what is interesting here is the traffickers, the male and the female breakdown, gender breakdown of who the traffickers are who are successfully prosecuted. And we've seen 39 males and 38 females. That's a very novel insight. We often think about, well, males are the traffickers, and we know females got a fingerprint on the operation, but here we have 39 males, 38 females, and it really gives us a very good glimpse in terms of the role that women often have in enabling organized crime, human trafficking, and very specifically sex trafficking in South Africa. Top tier nationalities for successfully prosecuted cases, we had South African nationals at 50, and again, Nigerian nationals at 15. Overwhelming majority, or the majority of cases, sex trafficking cases. Now, again, at the backdrop of the more than 11,000 reported cases, now please consider this, more than 11,000 cases on the SAPS CAS system, and then right at the other side of the tunnel, we only have 44 successfully prosecuted cases. So what I did in this cases, I used a new methodology, which I refer to as concentric mapping in human trafficking cases. And we're busy recording that in a journal article. And what concentric mapping, the premise of that is that a trafficking case and the testimony in a case is always, and I'm saying this again, always more than the sum of its parts. Again, many cases does not only have one victim and one perpetrator, but there are many others out there that when you testify in these cases, I've testified in several of these matters, especially the sex trafficking cases, when you hear the testimony of the victims and you interview the victims, you go through the court case docket, you realize that so many of these places of exploitation has been in operation for protracted periods. Many of them have been in operation for many years, right? I think the Aldino dos Santos matter was in operation for up to 8 years. So you can only imagine how many victims and possible victims went through those operations without any meaningful intervention by the police. So for those 44 cases, and this is what concentric mapping looks like, right? There were 78 cohort 1 victims. Now, the cohort 1 victims are the 78 that actually testified in those 44 cases. They were screened, they testified, they were cross-examined, they went through the process. Then there's a cohort 2 that we don't talk about, that the media doesn't report on. These were 25 that were successfully screened as victims of trafficking, yet they didn't testify. You know, maybe they fell ill, they passed away, or they might have absconded before testimony in court. Then we get cohort 3, which are the possible victims of trafficking. And these 130 victims, or rather possible, plausible victims, were those that were named by cohort 1 and cohort 2 victims, and they were in exactly the same circumstances, exploitation, coercion, together with cohort 1 and 2 victims were moved around from different places of exploitation. And they were named. So you had a Cindy, you had a John, you had an Angie, and we could therefore enumerate them. We could literally count them. Then cohort 4 was possible victims of trafficking, and we couldn't count them because we didn't have names for them, or it was a premises where a victim testified that in that place where I was kept, there were at least 5 other girls. This is approximately how old they were. And these are these narratives that, because we couldn't count them, or, you know, examples of, there were many others, or I saw at least, you know, how many others, we framed those as possibly multiple. So meaning that that could be many. Like one example would be a Hawks investigator that testified, and this is her words in the testimony. She said, well, listen, I tried to obtain statements from these women. They were all drug addicted. The whole building was full of victims of trafficking. Now, that's a narrative example of testimony. Now, clearly, what that means is there were many others, right? We couldn't count them, and that's one example of a case which was framed as possibly multiple. And then cohort 5 is what we call as the digital unknowns, and those were people exploited online that we literally couldn't count. So one example is the State versus Selesu. This was a 15-year-old girl that was trafficked from Lesotho. I also testified in that matter. She was obviously she was exploited in the sex trade, and also had a profile on a online website based in the United States called Streammate Models. She had over 6,000 logins to her profile over a period of 2 years, right? So now the reason why we refer to those as digital unknowns, because you clearly have consumer level demand for this type of content and exploitation, and inferring that there can only be several others out there. We didn't count them, we just say digital unknowns. Then what we also found in this research is, and please, if the journalists are out there, please listen, you know, some of these organizations, Red Velvet, Sex Trader, Escorts SA, Ads Africa, Glamour Girls, Some of these advertise on public roadways. Some of them on public roadways. And the one red velvet, there's at least 2 photographs I have where they were advertising literally in a 1 kilometer radius from a school. All of these platforms were implicated in successful sex trafficking matters, prosecutions, right? Now, I'm not even talking about civil society data, police data, and ongoing prosecutions. We know that many of them have been implicated in both adult and child sex trafficking cases. As far back as 2008 with the Adina dos Santos matter, we had these children that referred to these photographers that would come into these residential brothels. Photos would be taken of them, and these photos would be uploaded on the internet. So at that point in time, we didn't know who these platforms were, but clearly the internet plays a major role, and all of these online websites were implicated. Recently, I had a conversation with a group of around the issue of full decriminalization in South Africa. And I asked them, listen, what are some of the websites that are used in the trade? And they mentioned pretty much all of them were mentioned. And, we had to just state that all of them are also implicated in sex trafficking matters. This is what undercounting looks like. This is the Obi matter. 3 victims testified. There were at least 21 others that we don't know where they are. Maybe they fell through the cracks. These were 21 other victims that were mentioned in the testimony that found themselves in similar circumstances in residential brothels.
Marcel, just to let you know, I am here and have been listening intently. Yes, if only you could see me running up and down my house, upside down, on doing headstands. So, but you've covered a lot of what we were going to, and it's absolutely fascinating. But I know that, and we will come back, I think, to some of these that you have mentioned. So you can take a breath. Hello, everybody. Apologies for its load shedding. Unfortunately, when you think technology is going to play the game, it doesn't. So I've been listening to you for about a good 20 minutes, Marcel, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
You should.
So I know, no, it's fine. I know that you were really, really bent on, and you were very passionate about giving us a proper definition of human trafficking, because the lines have been blurred over the years. And maybe I missed that in the beginning. If you still want to do that, I think it's very necessary, and it may sound like a doff question, but it does affect how we identify who a victim or a survivor is of human trafficking. So would you mind if we went back a step and just gave a clear definition of human trafficking and where the lines have been blurred in recent years?
Sure. So I've literally got my phone open. I know this out of the top of my head, but I do not want to truncate this, because what is happening in research, people are using a 2-line definition, and that's where victims are undercounted. But basically it refers, there's an action that a person conducts, there's a means through which a person is trafficked, and there's always a purpose. And the purpose is any form of exploitation, but that could be delivering, recruiting, transporting, transferring, harboring a person or persons through the means. And the means could be a threat of harm, abuse of vulnerability, fraud, coercion, kidnapping, or the abuse of power that we often see with corruption. And then the purpose is always for the purpose of exploitation. Now, what is critical here is movement of a person is not a prerequisite for trafficking. You could literally be trafficked in a neighborhood. I had one case I testified in where the trafficker took the trafficked victim to visit her mom at the Wimpy every Saturday, and he would take her back home. The psychological control methods used. So that's very important. Movement is not a prerequisite. A child is a person under 18 there. The means doesn't have to transpire, and nobody can consent to being exploited. An initial consent, if I say, well, I want to do stripping, or I want to do this work in your home, subsequently, I am exploited and I no longer want to do it, that trafficker cannot rely on as a defense that you initially consented to that.
Okay, so and I think, like you say, it just depends on what version we've been given over the past couple of years, and even authorities that you've quoted now in your presentation haven't helped the cause, if we were to say that. And I know that you've gone into how big the problem is here in South Africa. I was just curious as to why this study was carried out in the first place, and why that particular time frame, 2020 to 2022.
Yeah, so right at the outset, Uveka, I mentioned why this specific methodology, and it was based on the fact that these claims that it's not a problem. I highlighted some quotes and quoted, Brigadier Vish Naidu. So that clearly, there was a disconnect between what some say the issue is and what others say the issue is not. But during that period, that's basically when we applied to do this research. And it just so happened to fall in the middle of COVID. So clearly the limitations of the study. I mean, we couldn't go out in the streets and do interviews with people. There's some limitations that there was. Many people were sick, many people passed away. So this happened in the middle of COVID. It just so happened that it coincided.
But just out of curiosity then, I mean, you would think that in a time like that, where movement was restricted, where there was lockdown, where if you were seen walking out, after a certain time, there were curfews, authorities would stop you and ask, what are you doing out here? Were we seeing, I mean, if it's possible to say in that time, were we seeing any kind of drop in human trafficking, or surprisingly enough, were they able to move undercover and carry on about this unseemly business?
Great question. There's no solid data on that. However, constant reports from civil society, the National Human Trafficking Hotline, people did report that there are fewer cases and calls being recorded. So you could make an informed inference that that could very well be what has happened. But again, I don't want to speculate. That has not been documented properly, but definitely authorities and NGOs reported a drop in reports. Yeah.
A drop in reports, but not necessarily a drop that in cases, or that this was actually happening, which is such a pity. Now, we know we managed to have our SAPSAC conference, and I think you've told everyone that we sit on that council together, the first one in a couple of years last year, and we heard about trafficking, like we say, mostly for sexual exploitation. That seems to be the common perception, but we also heard about that there are more children being targeted than we realize, Marcel. And we heard about trafficking for the purposes of harvesting organs, the targeting of albinos as well, which many people might not know. And then the spotlight falling on kidnappings in recent years. Is there any way to sort of, just give us a better idea of all the other purposes? Because commonly we think it's for sexual exploitation, as to why people and children are trafficked.
Yeah, great point. And again, research is always limited. There's no such thing as a perfect research study or catch-all study. It's impossible. But true, I mean, over the last 20 years, I've worked with countless different matters and obviously court cases ongoing, and that maybe, left the criminal justice court a role. But I mean, I would say labor could very well eclipse the magnitude of sex trafficking in South Africa. Professor Philip Frankel has done an incredible job in his book, Long Walk to Nowhere, Human Trafficking Post-Mandela South Africa. Please reach out to him. He's launching his new book in this week. So he's done phenomenal work in terms of the issue of labor trafficking. But on that issue, Uveka, 2 or 3 years ago, there was another study that came out around what they call artisanal mining. Now, the magnitude of trafficking in illegal mining is a big issue. I mean, I've got informants that I consistently work with in all of these spaces, and there's active recruitment of young men in rural Mozambique. And according to informants, just this one network brings in at least 55 men between the ages of 15 and 24 every weekend into the country. And I asked him, so why so many? And he said, well, suicide, murder, amputations, and etc. So a big issue in illegal mining. That's one issue. I've got multiple reports on record of muti-related or body part trafficking between Mozambique, Durban, and then offset offset areas in Johannesburg. Domestic servitude, we know that adoption scams has been documented in this report, where people present themselves as social workers and they buy and sell babies. So there's a vast array of, and obviously criminal exploitation, under which drug trafficking falls under. So yeah.
And I think we want to talk more about perpetrators, and we're going to get to a very sensitive part of that. But I think you were on the issue of online trafficking, Marcel, when I jumped in there earlier. And I think we need a bit more, if we can get back to that, as to, how much of a contributor is online trafficking? What is the nature of online trafficking? How does this happen? How does someone get drawn in that way?
Yeah, well, I'm literally submitting a paper later this evening for a journal on the use of technology and trafficking. And what is happening in South Africa. Often it's through the same platforms. I once sat in a kind of an undercover role with a trafficker in a bar, and we were having beers, and he showed me, he said, listen, this is what I'm using. He used his phone, and he claimed, and he opened Twitter, and he opened, I think it was Facebook. He's saying he's currently busy, as we were sitting in this restaurant bar, he was busy building relationships, and his words, 72 women. So he was bragging about the fact that he was busy, building a relationship with all of these women. So he's all over the place. He's sitting in Cape Town, but he claims to be this person in Port Elizabeth, etc. So Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp groups, social media is a big net where people are met and engaged, and where jobs are offered to unsuspecting victims. So technology plays an increasingly major role in recruitment and exploitation.
And I think, it's sad to say, Marcel, but post-COVID, people are going to be more vulnerable. Somebody could sit at home and go, how stupid are you? Why would you fall for that? But the thing is, if somebody has lost their job and they're desperate, and there is a job offer and something looks like it's going to make you some money, or somebody's been lonely for 2 years, or they're vulnerable at this point, they are going to fall into those nets. And it is easier than you think to actually fall into that kind of trap. And I think more and more, that's what we've been seeing. Now, we talk about
Uveka, you've reported on these issues for many years. I remember I first spoke to you in about 2014. So you know this, right?
Yeah. And we've been seeing it. And, I've been on the health and wellness side of things, and people's mental health, and, where you get some sort of validation from someone, or you made to feel like you belong in a certain group. It is very easy to get drawn into these things. And more of your findings in terms of the, trafficking in persons, perpetrators, and you were talking about the nature, we were talking about people posing as social workers in our conference as well last year, Marcel. We heard, as difficult as it is to believe, parents who are trafficking their own children, mothers who are selling off their 12-year-old's virginity for 150 Rand, 120 Rand, sometimes even 50 Rand. You cannot fathom it. Most of us can't, but there is that level of desperation. So let's get back to perpetrators, and the very, very touchy subject and the controversial one of foreign nationals who are perpetrators here in South Africa versus South Africans. Are we able to gauge just the role of foreign nationals versus how the proportion of foreign nationals and South Africans? And I know it is controversial, and I know it can be sensitive. So I'm gonna throw it onto you.
Sure. So I'm going to start with the first part of the question. Who are the perpetrators? It's everybody, family members, brothers, sisters, anybody can be a perpetrator. I mean, policemen, we've not yet convicted any of those, which is very unsettling. But yeah, it's perpetration. There's no specific profile of what the perpetrator looks like. What we do know is we know who the sex buyers are, and we know who the people are who use these services, whether it's for commercial sex or sex trafficking victims, or whether it's labor. And that is everyday South Africans, really. I've gone through records in preparation of court testimony, CCTV footage of people going into a residential brothel in Johannesburg where children, traffic victims were kept. I mean, the most luxury vehicles, Uveka. And interestingly, I remember making a mental note of, well, there's a white guy, there's a black South African, there's a color, a brown man, and there's an Indian guy. You know, so it's a microcosm of everybody, right? I think in terms of nationalities, you're right. I mean, it is a sensitive issue, and when I testify in court, whether it's in chief or in aggravation of sentencing, I do make this point, and I do put it on record that these are sensitive issues, and that that the court should take into consideration also how, when writing out, you know, sentencing procedures, that element needs to be considered, and the versions and the claims and the concerns of South Africans, that it be ventilated rather than dismissed, right? So all within a human rights framework, which is critical. But I mean, we know South Africans by far still eclipses any nationality in terms of perpetration, right? So we need to understand proportionality in terms of how many South Africans there are and how many foreign nationals are in the country. But South African nationals are involved in every sphere of trafficking. But it's been well documented, and I mentioned this also, Uveka, I'm not sure if you were online yet, that it's well documented. Firstly, let's start with labor trafficking. We consistently see Chinese nationals involved in labor-related trafficking. For many, many years already, we've seen that. Indian nationals, maybe Bangladeshi nationals with labor-related trafficking, that we see. The commercial sex trade, dating as far back as the mid-2000s, consistent mention of a few nationalities, including Russian, Bulgarian, but consistently referring to Nigerian criminal networks as dominating the commercial sex industry, where it comes with regards to trafficking, the nexus with commercial sex and sex trafficking, inextricably linked, Nigerian nationals. That's my experience as well. It's supported by several studies. It's supported by this study, and also the annual United States TIP reports that refer to this absolute prominence, footprint in that space.
And let's just delve a little bit more then into the sex trade then. And again, another contentious one, Marcel, because, you know, the decriminalization of the sex trade, there's this public comment on this at the moment. There's lots of heated debate about that. Whatever happens in this case, you know, how do we see it? Do we see it as being more harmful? Do we see it as being part of the solution? How big a part of the solution to damping down, to eradicating, if we are ever able as a human race to eradicate human trafficking, how big a part will that play, do you envisage?
Well, it depends on how the government see this, Uveka. The first thing that I want to state unequivocally, it's firstly acknowledging this is a very contentious and a very emotive issue. The second thing is prostitution and human trafficking is two different, legally defined different things. You cannot conflate them. There's often these claims in the media by groups arguing for full decrim, saying, well, people are conflating what they call sex work and human trafficking. Well, the law doesn't allow for that to happen. There's no way that a court is going to convict somebody on trafficking if it's not a trafficking matter. There's no way. And conversely, somebody who goes to a police station and claims to be exploited can also not be a consensual person in prostitution. So that argument, it really falls flat in so many areas. What we need to realize is that human trafficking is inextricably linked with the sex trade. Nowhere in the world, Uveka, will you find a sex trade without child sex trafficking, without adult sex trafficking. I use the examples of all of these websites that's been operating with impunity for more than a decade already, all of them implicated in sex trafficking. What we also know is, and it's my experience and also from these case analysis, which is the violent nature of so many sex buyers who, frankly, many of them cares precious little whether it's a child or an adult, or whether the person is there out of free will and whether the person is subjugated. So it's a very, very messy business. It's a compromised arena from A to Z. And I think we need to look at what is happening in other countries as well. And we often see New Zealand. And I just want to quickly quote, this week I read our incredible South Africans, Advocate Thuli Madonsela and Judge Edwin Cameron, amazing South Africans, However, I disagree with him on this issue. I'm going to use two examples. Advocate Thuli Madonsela that said that if full decrim takes place, that brothel owners can now be part of the social accountability network. They can now be the people policing traffickers and those who abuse. I'm quoting from the Mail and Guardian.
Yeah.
Judge Edwin Cameron mentioned that you don't get these kind of abuses in areas where the sex trade is fully decriminalized. That is absolutely not the truth. We need to look at what's happening in New Zealand, undercounting of trafficking, and traffickers using local laws to their advantage, and basically law enforcement, the abilities to go into these places of exploitation is fundamentally hamstrung. So now we need to understand, if that is the case elsewhere, what and how would that play out in South Africa? And I've got one more point to make there, if I may, Uveka, is
Marcel, while you're making that point, there's just been a request for you to please increase your volume if possible. There's a request from some of our viewers, our audience, if it's possible. And sorry for interrupting, but I didn't want them to miss that point.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me, Uveka?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, last point on that issue. I know that it is a very sensitive issue, but I mean, also from these news reports in this week, and there's a history to this. Again, the research that claims sex trafficking is not a problem, there's often this use of a moral panic, moral panic, and the claim made that people refer to people in prostitution as sinful people, etc. I find that very disconcerting. On so many ways, because often those claims are made and no example is used in how is that actually happening and how is that happening. And I'm afraid that when you use the moral panic argument is kind of deflecting from the fact that it's our faith community in South Africa, Uveka, that's in touch with the community. They are the one dealing with drug addiction, dealing with young girls going into prostitution, being trafficked. They are the ones there, and I've dealt with so many of these cases where victims of trafficking commit suicide, deep depression, being re-trafficked. So the faith community is very much in touch with what's happening in community. So we should be very careful not to kowtow faith communities' concerns around some of these issues. Yeah.
Okay. So I suppose in that discussion on the decriminalization of the sex trade, it's going to take us a while, I think, it's going to take us a very long time. It's going to take a lot of buy-in as well, and a lot of compromise, I would imagine, as well, Marcel. But in the meantime, the sad thing is we're going to have many, many victims, not even survivors. Like you talk about those who take their own lives. You're going to have victims, those who won't survive this entire process. In terms of, and you spoke of international, right? And we know that you spoke of how other countries are dealing with this. And we know that we cannot speak of South Africa in isolation when it comes to this, and how we are or are not actually cooperating with other countries, because we know trafficking, and I'm going to say this successfully for those who are the traffickers, they consider it a success once they've got someone over a border, once they're gone, and you are never going to be a person who's lost in that ether. How do we fare in terms of, how we are dealing with human trafficking? Is there a will here? Do South African authorities actually have the know-how? Do they have the tools? Do we have the expertise? And how well are we cooperating with international authorities? Because it's not just a matter of stopping it within here, it's a matter of stopping it from happening across our borders.
Yeah, Uveka, I'm going to start with the good news, and there's massive good news. And I want William and any journalist out there, I've got a name of 20 human trafficking champions in South Africa, government champions, social workers, prosecutors, investigators. Please, can we have their names on the front page? South Africans need good news stories. These are champions. To your question, however, Uveka, South Africa spent, I think, 4 of the last 5 years on the tier 2 watch list of the annual United States Trafficking Persons Report. Very disconcerting. And the issues that's consistently raised is the issue of corruption, the issue that we don't identify victims in the right way, the fact that we're not going after consumer level demand, which in effect might, the governments are proposing to make it all legal. So those are the things that have been pointed out. I've done a lot of work with Interpol over the years, and I've spoken at a conference in 2019 in Argentina And Interpol, interesting, I just mentioned the terrorism case that we dealt with and that we reported to the task teams. Literally at Interpol, the conference in Argentina, they present the key targets of a syndicate running through the African continent into South Africa. Literally, I sat with exactly the same name. So again, there's a lack of information exchange. Yes, there are great things happening. And again, coming back to these 20 amongst a number of other specialists, the system, Uveka, and I mentioned it in the week, is person dependent. So you've got individuals doing incredible work. But the system has so many crevices, you know, and that includes shelters that's often filled to the brim. That includes a police official that gets information now and he needs to go from Port Elizabeth to Bloemfontein in space an hour. There's not a budget for that. He needs to wait 3 days before that can happen. So the system doesn't always work. And I think we can do far better. Our next report will come out in March and unfortunately show that our task teams are not functional to the extent that they should. And there's a lot of crevices there as well.
So there was a question saying that movement is not such, or a statement saying that movement across borders, physical movement in terms of trafficking is not the biggest concern now, or is not the only way it's happening. We were talking about online. There was a question about how do we then police online trafficking? What's the key there to policing online trafficking? And another comment about the Palermo Protocol that needs an update that would possibly be form part of this. And I'd like you to build on that for us.
Okay, so I made this available I think I spoke to Deputy Minister John Jeffrey a while back. There's technology, incredible technology, that people are willing to pilot in South Africa at very little cost. And that is what you need to use. You need to use the system to combat the system, right? So you cannot only rely on humans to combat trafficking online. That's simply, you can't. So we need to adapt. We need to become more agile. And we've identified 15 demand reduction tactics. One of them is technology-based, where you actually use artificial intelligence, machine learning, and chatbots. And these can be released on online websites and platforms where trafficking is happening in South Africa. Please take me up on that. That can happen, and it's happening very successfully in other parts of the world. So that is the point, Uveka. You know, we need to equip ourselves. We need to become more updated in how we combat online trafficking. And the only way to do that is through augmented intelligence. That's artificial intelligence with human capacity that's augmented, machines and humans amplifying each other's strength.
Okay, and I think because we have this scheduled till from 1:30 to 2:30, we can probably push it a little bit. But I think let's just go to the recommendations of this report. Now that we're talking about solutions, let's just go from there to what this report has recommended, and just what needs to happen now to at least make a small change in the near future.
Yeah. I'm gonna run through many of them. The National Human Trafficking Hotline must become an official reporting mechanism. They have significant technology. They should become the go-to. They are there to hold government's arms up and amplify that. We need to use the right definition. The PACOTIP definition in Section 4 and the definition of abuse or vulnerability, if that is not explicated in any study that refers to human trafficking, then it's not a human trafficking study, because if we're not using definitions correctly, we can manipulate this any which way we want to, and that's been a problem. So research ethics councils, universities, research departments, make sure you use the right definition. I think the media has a massive role to play. The media has championed reporting on human trafficking for such a long time. There's obviously a better way to do it, and we all can improve. We all have blind spots. We don't always know when we don't know. The media has got a massive role in this. I cannot overstate that. This report was concluded in June 2022, and when we saw the vast demand for sex trafficked victims, for labor trafficked victims, it was just a logical progression, that we target the demand through Section 7 of the PACOTIP Act, the Prevention and Combating of Trafficking in Persons Act, and Section 11 and Section 17 of the Sexual Offences Act, which now, by the way, the government is proposing to repeal those laws. So that is concerning. We need to acknowledge the issue of consumer level demand, and the government needs to, I mean, you know, we need a national database. We need these statistics to be made available quarterly, both missing person statistics and trafficking statistics. And the last point here, we need to acknowledge the voices of the public. Do not be condescending when people on Twitter complain about issues related to exploitation. That's, you know, and I think that's a big problem here, is that these cases are not reported. And that's where you have people coming up with crazy stories about human trafficking in their neighborhoods. And many people have told me this. Yes. I made this story up because I was desperate. Otherwise, the police are not going to respond to my concerns. So there's a lot that needs to be done, Uveka.
Has got me thinking about the neighborhood, and you got me thinking about just a chat. I mean, I live in a complex in our group, and you know, we're passing these people every day at our traffic lights. We're passing them with those little stories coming out about the kids are being rented out by creches. Their parents don't even know. They have women sitting with them, you know, and many people don't know, is that just an urban myth? Is that really happening? My guess would be that majority of those kids, their parents are either saying, okay, take my child, sit with them, whatever you make, you give me a portion. Or some of them, yes, might not even know. They take their child to a creche, they fetch at 5 or 6 o'clock, and their child is sent with somebody else to create or to create a picture of, you know, where somebody is going to donate and create a picture of pity, a pity picture, if I were to call them. So when we talk about human trafficking, we're not just looking at, like William likes this, the Liam Neeson version of Taken. We're looking at even on this scale, and it's not a small scale, because this is every single traffic light that you see. And for me, that's human trafficking.
If it fits a definition. But yes, I've dealt with a case in 2019 where a very astute person of the community picked kids up in a poor area and he dropped them off at a traffic lights, and he would accommodate them over the weekends. He made about 400 rands per day per child. That's a lot of money. I wanted to use another example now, and it literally slipped my mind. But you're right, Uveka. This is how systemic it really is. Yeah, Mama Jackie, right? She had an orphanage in Tembisa, and I don't know how many kids she sold or traded as a social worker orphans over the years, because her orphanage was operational for many years. So its vulnerability is the glue that keeps all of this together. And we've got structural inequalities in South Africa that is deeply, deeply disconcerting. And that makes this a favorable destination. And South Africa is, as a source, transit and destination, a country for trafficking.
We've got desperation here, Marcel. We've got parents who have no choice but to leave children in places that are probably unregistered. I mean, these are just examples that we're using. We've got corruption, which is a big problem. We've got authorities that turn a blind eye. Who is checking that these places are credible, that they are registered? And that's just where it all starts. And what do we do then? Just to wrap it up, who needs to be doing what in terms of, yes, we spoke about the media needing to do more, that this is not a sexy story anymore. Human trafficking for a very long time. We've got corruption where cops aren't paid enough to bother enough, I suppose, or don't have the will to do it. We've got the higher up authorities, and then we've got us ordinary citizens who say, I've got my own problems. I can't worry about this person sitting at a traffic light now. I've got my own issues to deal with in 2023.
Yeah. Uveka, it's all that you mentioned. I think at the end of the day, we cannot lose hope. I mean, we are an incredible nation. The resilience is there. And I think it's indifference. You know, it's what we need. Collective compassion needs to be traded. We needs to cancel out indifference. And the issue of when we work as government officials, research, do not trade transparency for translucency. You're doing so much harm. And I think the government has got a major role to play here. Every South African citizen has a role to play here. So yeah, I mean, we could spend endless times about what do we need to do, Uveka. And I think it's do not lose hope. I think that's the first thing. And do know that, yeah, everybody can make a difference here.
Just a phone call, just letting somebody know you could start something. It all starts with a ripple, doesn't it? So Marcel, you next report coming out in March, a quick idea of what that focuses on exactly?
Yeah. So that is the comprehensive report in terms of engagements with civil society, provincial task teams. What do people say about the law? What are some of the perceptions about prevalence, etc.? So there's also an analysis of how, the political economy around human trafficking in South Africa. So that's definitely far broader. And I want to also say that there's another study that in tandem with this one took place in Cape Town, and they used the most statistical rigorous study methodology documented thus far. And I think Cape Town was the first study ever. And that findings, and they did a high-risk community in Hout Bay Cape Town, and the vulnerability indicators eclipsed previously high rates by the Global Slavery Index. So vulnerability and predispositions to trafficking is significant. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we look forward to that one. And I say look forward, and I know that the details are probably very depressing and very grisly. Yeah. But like I say, the more honest and shocking we are, the more likely we are to get some attention.
Yeah. And Uveka, I just want to make this comment very important. In the report, it states that, again, these views, I did the research, it does not represent, that of USAID and the partners, so just to make that very clear, I just have to put it out there. Yeah.
All right. And Marcel, there's been some requests for you to leave your details on the chat. I'm not sure, but you could probably post it on the chat and leave your details or contact details or email or whatever it is that you're comfortable for those who need to reach you for more detail. And joining us all the way from Washington. I'm not sure what the time is there now. It looks bright behind you, but in fact, probably didn't get much sleep anyway with all of this on your mind. And I apologize again for just, the load shedding issues on my side. I apologize on behalf of Eskom. I apologize on behalf of them, not myself. And yeah, I'm glad that we finally had a chance to have that conversation. So William, thank you for inviting me well to be a part of this.
Thank you, Uveka.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eva.
Thanks. Well done, Marcel. So proud of you.
Margie!
Thank you very much for this informative session.
Where are you, Margie? Are you in the UAE?
I am. I'm in Abu Dhabi.
Oh, wow. You are one of my mothers. You know that, right?
You are an amazing young man. What a privilege.
Well, you see all the gray hair. I've got more than you, Margie. So